The silence of Keisha. Peter sat at the kitchen table, his fingers drumming lightly on the wooden surface, the tick of the clock the only sound filling the room. The silence of his home, once comforting, now pressed heavily on his heart. His thoughts spiraled back to Keisha, his 4-year-old daughter, whose laughter had always been the joy of his life, but now seemed to be a distant memory. Ever since she had started preschool, something had changed. The once bubbly and chatty little girl who eagerly shared her adventures was now withdrawn, quiet, and somber. Peter had always prided himself on being an attentive father. As a single dad, raising Keisha on his own since her mother passed away shortly after she was born, he had learned to balance tenderness with the firmness of fatherhood. They had always been a team. Her curls bounced as much as her enthusiasm, and her questions about the world were endless. Yet recently, those questions had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that left him feeling helpless and concerned. "Daddy, can I stay home today?" Keisha's small voice broke through his thoughts one early morning, her fingers clutching the blanket, as if it were a shield. Peter's heart sank. "Sweetheart, you love school," he said, trying to coax out a smile, but Keisha just shrugged, her brown eyes avoiding his. She no longer talked about her day or showed excitement about her classmates. Her favorite stuffed elephant, Ellie, now sat forgotten on her bed, an alarming sign for Peter. Ellie had been her comfort, her companion in a world that sometimes felt too big for her tiny frame. Peter kneeled down to Keisha's level. "Is something happening at school, baby?" he asked softly, his voice full of concern. Keisha hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her pajamas. I don't know, Daddy. It's just, I don't want to go. Can't I stay here with you?" Her voice was small, fragile, like she was carrying a burden far too heavy for a child her age. Peter felt the familiar pang of worry tighten in his chest. His little girl, his bright, beautiful Keisha, was retreating into a shell. He had tried everything. Extra time at the playground, playdates, even talking to her teacher, but nothing seemed to get through to her. That evening, Peter sat alone after putting Keisha to bed, staring at the soft glow from the nightlight spilling into the hallway. His mind raced with questions. What was happening to her? Was she being bullied, teased, or worse? The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that something was wrong. He had noticed the subtle changes, the way her shoulders slumped, how her once vibrant conversations turned into single-word responses, and how her laughter was now a rare sound. He knew in his gut that Keisha was suffering, and as her father, he felt powerless to stop it. Desperation led Peter to consider what he had never imagined he would. Surveillance. He needed to know what was happening in her world when he wasn't there to protect her. But how? He couldn't exactly walk into her classroom and watch, and even if he did, would Keisha open up? She was only 4, and there were things she didn't have the words for yet. Sitting up late one night, Peter's eyes caught sight of his laptop on the table. His heart raced as an idea began to form, though he hesitated. Was it right? Was he crossing a line? He quickly dismissed the doubts. His daughter's well-being was at stake. Opening the laptop, Peter searched for discrete recording devices. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly, but after some scrolling, he found it. A small wireless microphone, no bigger than a button, designed to blend into everyday items. His finger hovered over the Buy Now button, uncertainty gnawing at him. What would he hear? And once he had the information, what would he do? Yet, as he recalled the way Keisha's lips trembled when she said, "Some kids made me feel sad," Peter knew he had no choice. The device could give him the answers he needed to help his daughter. With a deep breath, he clicked the button and placed the order. The next few days felt like an eternity as Peter waited for the package to arrive. Keisha's mood hadn't improved. At breakfast, she barely touched her food. On the walk to school, she stayed quiet, holding his hand limply, as though even that small gesture took too much effort. It broke his heart to see her like this. Every time he tried to ask her what was wrong, Keisha would just shrug or mumble, "I'm fine, Daddy," but her sad eyes betrayed her. Peter couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. He needed to know what was happening in her life, but how far was too far. He replayed the conversation with her teacher in his head. "Kesha's quiet," the teacher had said, "but some children are just naturally reserved. Give her time." Yet Peter knew his daughter. This wasn't just shyness or adjustment. Something had dimmed her spark, and Peter was determined to get it back. The day the package arrived, Peter felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Holding the tiny device in his hand, he examined it closely. It was smaller than he had imagined, perfect for what he needed, small enough to be hidden in Kesha's hair or a headband without being noticed. That evening after dinner, Peter called Kesha into the living room. She sat on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest, the once lively girl now a shadow of her former self. "Kesha, come here, baby," Peter said, patting the couch beside him. She shuffled over, her curls bouncing as she moved. Peter gently stroked her hair, his fingers lightly brushing through the tight coils. "Your hair is so beautiful," he whispered, feeling a lump in his throat. He had told her this many times before, but he couldn't help but wonder if her hair, her uniqueness, was part of the problem. Had someone at school made fun of it? The thought made his stomach turn. "Kesha, I know it's been hard at school lately," Peter began carefully, watching her expression closely. "I'm going to put something in your hair tomorrow, okay? It's just a little clip, like a pretty bow. But it's special. It will help me hear you, so if you feel sad or scared, I'll know, and I can help you." Kesha looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion. "But Daddy, why do you need to hear me?" Peter hesitated for a moment. How could he explain this in a way she would understand without scaring her? "Sometimes, baby, daddies need to know things to keep their little girls safe, and I want to make sure you're okay, even when I'm not with you. Can you do that for me?" She nodded slowly, still unsure but trusting her father, as she always had. That night, after tucking Kesha into bed, Peter sat up in his room, staring at the small device on his nightstand. Tomorrow, he would slip it into her hair, and then he would finally know. The weight of uncertainty hung heavy in the air as Peter lay down to sleep, knowing that once the device was in place, nothing would ever be the same again. But for Kesha's sake, he was willing to take that risk. The echoes of the playground. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long beams of light across Peter's kitchen. Kesha sat at the table, her small hands resting on the wooden surface as she stared blankly at her bowl of cereal. She had always loved mornings, cartoons flickering in the background, the sweet crunch of her favorite sugary loops. But now, even the brightly colored box couldn't pull a smile from her. Peter stood by the counter, watching her closely. His heart ached. Today was the day he would put the recording device in her hair, and the weight of that decision sat heavily on his shoulders. Was it the right thing to do? Would it help her? Or was he invading her privacy, betraying her trust in some way? He shook the thoughts from his mind. He had to do this. He had to protect his daughter. "Kesha," Peter said gently, walking over to her. "I have something for you." He knelt beside her, holding the small device in his palm. It looked like a simple barrette, a shiny clip that could easily disappear into her curls. Kesha blinked up at him, her brown eyes full of curiosity, but also uncertainty. "Daddy, what is that?" she asked, her voice soft and tentative. Peter smiled reassuringly. "Remember last night? I told you I was going to give you something special. This will help me stay close to you, even when I'm not around." He reached for a section of her hair, carefully clipping the device in place, making sure it was hidden among her thick curls. "See, you won't even feel it." Kesha touched her hair, her fingers brushing against the clip, and nodded. "Okay, Daddy, but why do you need to be with me all the time?" Peter's smile faltered for just a moment. How could he explain the fear that gnawed at him? The fear of the unknown, of what was happening to her when he wasn't there to protect her. "Because I love you," he finally said, pulling her into a hug. "And I want to make sure you're happy and safe." Kesha's arms wrapped around his neck, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, Peter felt her small body relax into him. He held her close, savoring the moment before pulling away. "All right, kiddo. Time to get ready for school." The walk to school was quiet, as it had been for days. Kesha held his hand, her fingers small and cold against his, but she didn't speak. Peter tried to make light conversation, asking her what games she was going to play with her friends, but she only shrugged in response. His stomach twisted with anxiety. What would the recording reveal? What was really going on in her day-to-day life that she wasn't telling him? As they reached the school gates, Kesha hesitated. Peter knelt down beside her, his hands resting on her small shoulders. "You'll be okay today, right?" he asked softly. Kesha gave a small nod, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "Bye, Daddy," she whispered, before turning and walking toward the playground. Peter watched her go, her small frame seeming even smaller as she disappeared into the crowd of children. He wanted to call her back, to hug her one more time, but he resisted. She needed to be strong, and so did he. Peter returned home, his thoughts racing. The house felt too quiet without Kesha's laughter or the sound of her running through the halls. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the cool wood, his eyes staring blankly at the device on his phone that would connect to the recorder in Kesha's hair. It was surreal, knowing that at any moment he could tap into her world and hear everything that was happening around her. He hesitated for what felt like hours before finally picking up the phone and opening the app. His heart pounded in his chest as the feed connected, a faint hum of static filling his ears. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sounds of the schoolyard, the distant laughter of children, the clatter of playground equipment. Peter closed his eyes, listening intently. Then, through the noise, he heard her voice. Kesha was talking to someone, her tone quiet and uncertain. "Do you really think my hair looks funny?" she asked, her words barely audible, but Peter could hear the vulnerability in them. His breath caught in his throat. Who was she talking to? He strained to listen as another child's voice responded, sharp and mocking. "Yeah, it's all puffy and weird. My mom says it's because you don't have the same kind of hair as us." Peter's hands clenched into fists. He felt a surge of anger rise within him. He had suspected it might be about her hair, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. How could someone say something like that to a little girl? His little girl. Kesha's hair had always been her crown, a beautiful, natural display of her heritage, and now it was the source of her pain. Kesha's voice came through again, quieter this time, almost defeated. "But my daddy says my hair is special," she said softly. "Whatever," the other child replied, her tone dismissive. "You're just different. That's why nobody wants to play with you." Peter's heart shattered at those words. He had always known the world could be cruel, especially for someone like Kesha, a young black girl in a predominantly white school, but he had hoped, prayed, that she wouldn't have to face that cruelty so soon. He felt helpless, sitting there, listening to his daughter's pain unfold in real time, unable to reach through the phone and comfort her. The conversation continued, with Kesha trying to defend herself, but each of her words was met with more teasing and laughter. Peter's stomach twisted with every hurtful comment, each insult feeling like a personal attack. He couldn't listen anymore. He had heard enough. His hand trembled as he turned off the recording, his mind racing with what to do next. Peter paced the kitchen, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and guilt. He had sent her into that school every day, thinking it was a safe space for her to grow and learn, but instead, it was where she was being torn down. He felt like he had failed her, failed to protect her from the harshness of the world. But now that he knew the truth, he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He had to act. He had to make it right. Peter's first instinct was to march down to the school, to demand a meeting with the principal and Kesha's teacher, to confront the parents of the children who had hurt her. But as he sat down and tried to calm himself, he realized that wasn't the answer. He couldn't fight Kesha's battles for her. Not this time. She needed to learn how to stand up for herself, to find her own voice in the face of adversity. But she didn't have to do it alone. That evening after dinner, Peter sat Kesha down in the living room, pulling her close. "Sweetheart," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I heard what happened today at school. I heard what those kids said to you." Kesha's eyes widened, fear and embarrassment flashing across her face. "Daddy, how did you?" Peter held up a hand. "I told you, remember? I put something in your hair so I could hear you, so I could help you." Kesha's lip quivered, and she looked down at her lap, her small hands gripping the fabric of her dress. "I didn't want to tell you," she whispered. "I didn't want you to be mad." "Oh, baby," Peter said, pulling her into his arms. "I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at the kid who hurt you. But more than that, I'm proud of you for being so strong." Kesha sniffled, burying her face in his chest. "But Daddy, I don't feel strong. I feel different." Peter gently lifted her chin, his eyes locking with hers. "You are different, Kesha. And that's what makes you amazing. You don't have to look like everyone else to be beautiful. Your hair, your skin, everything about you is special. And don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Kesha nodded, but Peter could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. It would take time for her to truly believe his words, to understand that her difference was her strength. But Peter was determined to help her get there. As he held his daughter close, Peter knew that this was just the beginning. The world wasn't going to change overnight, and neither would Kesha's struggles, but they would face it together, hand in hand. He would give her the tools she needed to navigate the challenges ahead, to stand tall in the face of adversity. For now, though, all he could do was hold her and remind her of one simple truth. She was loved, she was special, and she would never be alone. Unseen scars. The days following Peter's discovery felt like walking through a fog. The invisible weight of what Kesha had endured sat heavily on his chest. Every morning as he prepared her for school, brushing her soft curls and gently clipping the recording device back into place, Peter struggled to push down the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. He didn't want Kesha to see how furious he was. Not at her, never at her, but at the cruelty of the world that was already pressing its weight on her young shoulders. It wasn't just about the teasing. The deeper pain was the erosion of Kesha's spirit, the way her light seemed dimmer, her laughter less frequent. Peter had always marveled at her joyful energy, how she danced through life with the kind of freedom that only children possess. But now that light had been dulled, dimmed by the words of children who had no idea the depth of their cruelty. Peter had to remind himself that these were children, innocent, in a way, shaped by the world around them. It wasn't enough to blame them alone. Their words were echoes of things they had heard from their own parents or other adults, opinions passed down about differences they barely understood. It was systemic, it was deep, and it was terrifying to realize that, as much as he wanted to protect Kesha, the world she was growing up in would never be entirely kind. The following weekend, Peter decided it was time for a change. He couldn't simply rely on his own quiet reassurances to rebuild his daughter's confidence. He had to show her, teach her, and surround her with strength, pride, and love. It wasn't just about comforting her after the fact. It was about giving her the tools to stand tall before the next blow even came. "Hey, Kesh," Peter said one Saturday morning as she sat in front of the television, her eyes glued to the cartoons that usually made her laugh, but now only earned distracted stares. "What do you think about taking a little trip today?" Kesha glanced up at him, her interest barely piqued. "Where are we going?" Peter leaned down, ruffling her hair gently. "It's a surprise, but I think you'll like it." The drive to the city was quiet. Kesha sat in the back seat, her stuffed elephant, Ellie, clutched tightly in her arms. Peter had finally found the toy buried in her room a few days earlier, and while Kesha hadn't said much about its absence, her relief at its return had been palpable. It was as though a part of her had been missing without that familiar comfort. Peter parked the car in front of a small building on the outskirts of the city's historic district. It was unassuming, with a simple sign that read Crown Collective. But to Peter, this place was magic. It was a haven he'd discovered during a particularly difficult time, when he'd been trying to figure out how to care for Kesha's hair after her mother left. Inside, the shop catered to all things natural and beautiful for Black women and girls: clothing, books, art, and most importantly, hair care products designed for the very curls that were now the focus of Kesha's pain. Kesha's eyes widened as they stepped inside. The walls were lined with bright, colorful paintings of Black women in all their natural beauty. Women with curls like hers, women with braids, women with afros. Everywhere she looked, there were faces that reflected her own. Peter watched her face, waiting for the moment when her awe would turn into something more: recognition, pride, connection. "Daddy, look," she exclaimed, pointing to a painting of a young girl about her age, her curls bouncing around her face as she twirled in a bright yellow dress. "She looks like me." Peter smiled, kneeling beside her. "She does. And she looks happy, doesn't she?" Kesha nodded, her eyes still wide as she took in the sight. "Yeah, she does. She's pretty." "She is," Peter agreed. "And so are you." A woman approached them from behind the counter, her own hair styled in intricate braids that cascaded down her back. Her skin was dark and glowing, and her smile was warm as she knelt down to Kesha's level. "Hey there, little one," she said softly. "What's your name?" "Kesha," she whispered, still a bit overwhelmed by everything around her. "Well, Kesha," the woman said with a wink, "you have the most beautiful curls I've ever seen. You're like a little queen, and we're all about queens here." Kesha's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her feet, a shy smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Peter watched, his heart swelling with hope. This was what Kesha needed: spaces where she was celebrated, where her beauty was the standard, not something to be mocked or ridiculed. He wanted her to see that the world was much bigger than the small, narrow minds of the children who teased her. There were people, communities, and places that saw her for who she was and loved her for it. Over the next hour, the woman, who introduced herself as Nia, guided Kesha and Peter through the shop, showing them different hair products and teaching Peter how to care for Kesha's curls in a way that made them shine. She demonstrated on a small mannequin head, her fingers nimble and skilled as she twisted the hair into intricate braids and twists. Kesha watched with wide eyes, occasionally reaching out to touch the soft curls on the mannequin. "Would you like me to do your hair, Kesha?" Nia asked gently, after a while. "I bet we could come up with something really special." Kesha hesitated for a moment before nodding shyly. Peter gave her an encouraging smile, and together they sat down at a small station in the back of the shop. As Nia worked, she told Kesha stories. Stories of queens from Africa with hair as wild and beautiful as hers. Stories of women who fought for their right to wear their hair naturally, to celebrate who they were without shame. Peter watched as Kesha's posture slowly changed. Her shoulders, which had been hunched and tight for weeks, began to relax. Her hands, once fidgeting with anxiety, now rested calmly in her lap. And as Nia finished her work, presenting Kesha with a mirror, Peter saw something he hadn't seen in far too long. Kesha smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes. The style was simple yet elegant, with twists that framed her face and accentuated her natural curls. Kesha's fingers traced the lines of her hair, her eyes wide with wonder. I look like a queen," she whispered. "You are a queen," Nia said with a proud smile. "Don't you ever forget that, Kesha." Peter felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched his daughter beam at her reflection. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when Kesha began to see herself the way he had always seen her, as beautiful, strong, and worthy of every bit of love and admiration the world had to offer. As they left the shop, Kesha's confidence seemed to radiate from her in a way that Peter hadn't seen in weeks. She held her head high, her steps light and free. For the first time in what felt like forever, Peter felt a glimmer of hope. That night, as he tucked Kesha into bed, Peter sat beside her, brushing his hand gently through her freshly styled hair. "Did you have fun today, sweetheart?" Kesha nodded, her eyes sleepy but content. "Yes, Daddy. I liked the lady with the braids. She said I was a queen." Peter smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's because you are, Kesha, and don't ever forget it." She snuggled into her pillow, her stuffed elephant tucked under her arm. "Daddy?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper in the dim light of her room. "Yeah, baby. Do you think the kids at school will like my hair now?" Peter's heart clenched at the question. He had hoped she wouldn't still be thinking about the kids at school, but he knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't know, Kesha," he said honestly. "But it doesn't matter what they think. What matters is that you like it. What matters is that you know how beautiful and special you are." Kesha was quiet for a long moment, and Peter wondered if she had fallen asleep. But then, in a soft, sleepy voice, she whispered, "I know, Daddy. I know I'm special." Peter leaned down and kissed her forehead, his heart full. As he turned off the light and left the room, he realized that the road ahead would still be difficult. There would still be days when Kesha faced challenges, when the world tried to make her feel small. But now she was armed with something powerful, knowledge of her own worth, a sense of pride in who she was. And as long as Peter was there, he would make sure she never forgot it. The battle within. Peter stood in front of the kitchen counter, staring at the coffee mug in his hands, as if it held the answers to all his questions. The sun filtered through the window, casting soft morning light over the table where Kesha sat, her fingers toying absent-mindedly with her spoon. She was humming quietly, a faint tune that Peter recognized as the theme from one of her favorite cartoons. On the surface, everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But there was a tension in the air, an uneasiness that had taken root in Peter's chest ever since that day at the Crown Collective. Kesha's hair looked stunning, her twists still holding up beautifully, the shine in her curls reflecting the sunlight like tiny coils of gold. She'd left the shop brimming with pride, walking taller than Peter had seen in weeks. He had dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd turned a corner. But the school days that followed had been anything but easy. The first day back, Kesha had practically skipped out the door, eager to show off her new hairstyle. Peter had watched her walk into the school with a knot of hope and fear twisting in his stomach. When he picked her up that afternoon, the light in her eyes had dimmed again. She'd said nothing on the car ride home, just stared out the window, her fingers running through her hair, pulling at the ends of her twists as though trying to unravel something more than just the strands. Now, 3 days later, that silence was suffocating. Peter couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong, that Kesha's struggles at school weren't just about her hair anymore. It was as if the weight of everything, the teasing, the isolation, the confusion, was pressing down on her in ways she couldn't explain, and Peter was at a loss for how to help her navigate it. "Kesha," he said softly, placing his coffee down and sitting across from her at the table. "How's school been this week?" Her eyes flicked up to meet his briefly before returning to her bowl of cereal. "It's fine, Daddy," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the hum of the refrigerator. Peter studied her face. There was a stiffness to her posture, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. He had learned to read her silence over the past few weeks, and this silence wasn't fine. "Are you sure? You haven't been talking much about it lately. You can tell me anything, Kesha. You know that, right?" She nodded, her eyes still downcast. "I know." But she didn't say anything more. Peter sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to push, to pry open the shell she was building around herself, but he also didn't want to force her. He had learned from the past that sometimes, no matter how hard he tried, Kesha wouldn't talk until she was ready. He had to be patient, had to let her come to him in her own time. But that patience was killing him. Every day that passed without her opening up felt like another day lost, another day where she was battling something alone. "Okay," Peter said gently, standing up and walking over to her. He kissed the top of her head, letting his lips linger against her curls for a moment longer than usual. "Just remember I'm here, whenever you're ready to talk." Kesha looked up at him and smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I know, Daddy," she whispered again. As Peter watched her gather her backpack and leave for school, he felt a familiar helplessness creep over him. This was something he couldn't fix with a hug or a kind word. It was something bigger, something that had taken root deep inside his daughter, and no matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't pull it out on his own. That evening, after Keisha had been tucked into bed, Peter sat in the living room, his laptop glowing in the dim light. He had spent hours combing through parenting forums, searching for answers, advice, anything that might help him understand what his daughter was going through. But none of it felt quite right. Keisha wasn't just any child facing a rough patch at school. She was a black girl in a predominantly white environment, navigating an experience that few could truly understand. Peter had read the research, had seen the studies about how black girls faced unique pressures in schools, pressures that ranged from microaggressions to outright discrimination. He'd seen the statistics about how often black girls were disciplined more harshly than their white peers, how they were often labeled as difficult or disruptive for behavior that was no different from other children's. But knowing these things in the abstract wasn't the same as watching his own daughter suffer because of them. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking his train of thought. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from Kesha's teacher, Miss Thompson. "Ms. Thompson, hi, Mr. Morgan. I wanted to check in with you about Keisha. She's been very quiet in class lately. I'm concerned. Do you think she's okay?" Peter's stomach clenched as he read the message. He had hoped that whatever was going on, it wasn't showing in her schoolwork or her behavior. But now, knowing that even Miss Thompson had noticed something was wrong, Peter couldn't ignore it any longer. He texted back quickly, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts. "Peter, thank you for letting me know. She hasn't been herself at home either. Do you think there's something happening at school?" The response came almost immediately. "Ms. Thompson, it's hard to say. Some of the other kids have been teasing her a bit, but nothing too serious. I've spoken to them about it, and I've been keeping an eye on her, but Keisha hasn't said much. I'm worried it might be affecting her more than she's letting on." Peter felt a surge of frustration. Nothing too serious. How could it not be serious when his daughter was withdrawing more and more every day? How could Miss Thompson, someone he trusted to protect and care for Keisha while she was at school, brush off something that was clearly hurting her? "Peter, I think it's affecting her more than we realize. I'll talk to her again, but please keep an eye on her. I appreciate your help." He put the phone down and leaned back on the couch, staring up at the ceiling. He felt powerless, and it was the worst feeling in the world. Every instinct as a father told him to storm into the school, demand answers, protect Keisha at all costs. But what would that accomplish? He couldn't shelter her from everything, couldn't keep the world from being the cruel place it sometimes was. What he could do, what he had to do, was give her the tools to face it head on. But how? The next morning, Peter woke up determined. If Keisha wasn't ready to talk, then he would show her that she wasn't alone, that she had a history and a legacy of strength behind her. He wasn't going to let her face the world's cruelty without knowing where she came from and who she was. "Hey, Kesh," he said over breakfast. "I was thinking we could do something different today. Instead of cartoons after school, what if we read a story together?" Kesha glanced up from her cereal, her eyebrows raised in mild surprise. "A story?" "Yeah," Peter said, smiling. "Not just any story. I thought we could read about some amazing black women in history. How does that sound?" Kesha hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess." Peter didn't push it. He knew it would take time to get her excited about something like this, but he was willing to be patient. After school, when they sat down in the living room, Peter pulled out a book he had picked up earlier that day. Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History. He opened the first page and began to read, his voice soft and steady, as he told Kesha about women like Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and Maya Angelou. He watched as Kesha's eyes flickered with interest, her fingers resting lightly on the pages as though she was trying to absorb the strength of the women whose stories filled the book. By the time they finished the first chapter, Kesha was leaning into him, her head resting against his arm. "Daddy," she said softly, "I didn't know there were so many black women who did such amazing things." Peter smiled, kissing the top of her head. "There are more than you can even imagine, Kesha. And you know what? You're just as special as any of them. You have that same strength inside you." Kesha looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Really? Really," Peter said firmly. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not good enough. You come from a long line of strong, beautiful black women who changed the world. And you can change the world too." For the first time in what felt like forever, Peter saw the glimmer of something new in Kesha's eyes. Hope. And maybe, just maybe, that hope was the beginning of something stronger than the pain she had been carrying. The breaking point. The following week passed in a blur of subtle changes, small moments where Peter could sense Kesha was beginning to find her footing again. After their nightly reading sessions, she started to open up just a little more. Her smile returned, tentative but genuine, and Peter watched as she slowly regained the spark that had seemed so distant. The stories of powerful black women, those who had faced insurmountable odds, who had persevered, seemed to reach Kesha in a way nothing else had. But even with the flickers of improvement, Peter knew that something still lingered beneath the surface. He could feel it in the way Kesha would sometimes grow quiet for no reason, her eyes distant as though she were somewhere else. It was like a shadow that hung over her, waiting to pounce. One evening, as Peter tucked Kesha into bed, she grabbed his hand, holding it tighter than usual. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small in the darkened room. Peter sat on the edge of her bed, brushing a curl away from her face. "What is it, sweetheart?" She hesitated, biting her lip as though struggling to find the right words. What if the other kids don't stop?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded with fear. Peter felt his heart squeeze in his chest. He had known, deep down, that things hadn't fully resolved at school, that Kesha was still carrying the weight of her experiences there. But hearing her voice it so directly made the reality of her pain all the more crushing. Peter leaned in, his voice gentle but firm. "Kesha, I can't promise that people won't say mean things. I wish I could. But what I can promise is that no matter what they say, it doesn't change who you are. You are strong, smart, and beautiful, and nothing anyone says can take that away from you." Kesha's eyes shimmered in the dim light, her fingers gripping the edges of her blanket tightly. But what if I'm not strong enough? What if they keep making fun of me?" Peter's heart broke at the vulnerability in her voice. He wished he could take away her fear, shield her from the cruelty of the world. But he also knew that she needed more than just his protection. She needed to believe in herself. "Being strong doesn't mean you don't get hurt," Peter said softly. "It means you keep going, even when it's hard. And it's okay to feel sad or scared. But every time you stand up for yourself, even if it's just in your heart, you're getting stronger." Kesha looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. "What if I can't stand up for myself?" Peter kissed her forehead, his voice steady with conviction. "Then I'll be there to stand with you, always." The next morning, Peter walked Kesha to school, his hand wrapped protectively around hers. She seemed quieter than usual, her steps a little slower, as if she were dreading what the day might bring. Peter felt the familiar knot of anxiety twist in his stomach, but he tried to keep his own fears hidden. When they reached the school gate, Kesha stopped and looked up at Peter. "Daddy, do you think it'll get better?" Peter knelt down to her level, his hands resting on her small shoulders. "I think it will. But even if it doesn't right away, we'll get through it together." Kesha nodded, her face a mix of determination and uncertainty. Peter watched as she walked into the building, her backpack bouncing slightly with each step. His chest tightened with worry, but he forced himself to let her go, hoping that today would be different. But it wasn't. That afternoon, when Peter arrived to pick Kesha up, He immediately sensed something was wrong. She walked out of the school building slowly, her head hanging low, her shoulders slumped. Her usual light, quick steps were replaced by heavy, dragging ones. She looked defeated, as though every ounce of strength had been drained from her small body. Peter's heart dropped. He rushed over to her, kneeling down in front of her to meet her eyes. "Kesha, what happened?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and her lips trembled as she tried to speak. They said I looked like a clown." The words hit Peter like a punch to the gut. He could feel the anger boiling up inside him, but he forced it down, knowing that his rage wouldn't help Kesha right now. She needed comfort, not his frustration. He gently pulled her into a hug, feeling her small frame shake with quiet sobs. "Who said that?" Peter asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though his fists clenched involuntarily. "Was it the same kids?" Kesha nodded into his chest. "They were laughing at my hair again. And they pushed me." Peter's grip tightened around her, his anger bubbling to the surface despite his best efforts to control it. He had tried to be patient, tried to let the school handle things, but this was too much. His daughter was being bullied, physically hurt now, and he couldn't just stand by and let it continue. "Okay," Peter said softly, pulling back to look her in the eyes. "We're going to fix this, Kesha. I promise." The drive home was quiet, Kesha staring out the window while Peter's mind raced. He had already spoken to the teacher, already tried to work with the school to address the teasing. But now, it was clear that this wasn't just a small issue. This was an ongoing problem, and the school wasn't doing enough to protect Kesha. Peter glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his heart aching at the sight of her sad, tired face. He knew he had to take things into his own hands now. Enough was enough. When they got home, Peter helped Kesha with her backpack and then knelt in front of her. "Kesha, I want you to know that you don't have to go through this alone. Tomorrow, we're going to talk to the principal together, okay? And we're going to make sure this stops." Kesha hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "But what if they get mad at me for telling?" Peter's face softened, and he cupped her cheek gently. "No one should ever make you feel bad for standing up for yourself. You have every right to feel safe at school, and I'm going to make sure that happens." Kesha nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and uncertainty. Peter could see that she wanted to believe him, but the fear of what might happen next still weighed heavily on her. He hated that she had to go through this, hated that the world was forcing her to confront such ugliness at such a young age. But he was determined to fight for her, to make sure she knew that she was worth fighting for. The next morning, Peter woke up with a sense of purpose. He had spent most of the night thinking about what needed to happen next, about how he was going to advocate for his daughter, about what steps he needed to take to ensure that this bullying stopped for good. When Kesha came down for breakfast, she looked anxious, her eyes darting to the clock as though counting down the minutes until she had to face school again. Peter placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, Kesha. Today's going to be different." They arrived at the school earlier than usual, Peter holding Kesha's hand as they walked toward the front office. His heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was unshakable. He wasn't leaving this school until he knew that his daughter would be safe. When they reached the principal's office, Peter introduced himself to the secretary and requested a meeting with Principal Carter. The secretary smiled politely, but Peter could see the hesitation in her eyes. Clearly, this wasn't the first time a parent had come in with concerns about bullying. After a few minutes, they were ushered into the principal's office. Principal Carter, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, greeted them with a warm smile. "Mr. Morgan, Kesha, please have a seat. What can I do for you?" Peter took a deep breath, then launched into an explanation of what had been happening over the past few weeks, the teasing, the isolation, the physical bullying that had escalated. As he spoke, Kesha sat quietly beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Principal Carter listened attentively, her expression growing more serious with each passing minute. When Peter finished, she leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Morgan, I want to assure you that we take bullying very seriously here. What you're describing is unacceptable, and we will address it immediately." Peter nodded, though a part of him still felt uneasy. He had heard promises like this before, but nothing had changed. "I appreciate that, Principal Carter, but I need to know that something concrete is going to happen. My daughter deserves to feel safe at school." Principal Carter met his gaze, her expression softening. "You're absolutely right. I will speak with the students involved, and will implement a plan to ensure that Keisha is protected. I'll also arrange for her to meet with our school counselor, so she has someone to talk to if she's feeling overwhelmed." Keisha glanced up at Peter, and he could see the flicker of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As they left the school, Peter knelt down beside Keisha, his hands resting on her shoulders. "We're going to make this better, okay? I promise." Keisha nodded, and for the first time in days, she gave him a small smile. Peter felt a weight lift off his chest. It wasn't over, but they were finally on the path to making things right. And no matter what, he would be there, fighting for his daughter every step of the way. A new beginning. It had been 2 weeks since Peter and Keisha's meeting with Principal Carter, and though the situation had not changed overnight, things were slowly improving. Peter could see the small shifts, how Keisha walked a little taller each day, how her eyes met his when he asked about school, and how her laughter, once fragile, now rang out more often during their time together. But there were still scars, emotional ones, deeper than Peter could ever fully comprehend. He watched his daughter with a careful eye, always alert for the subtle signs of pain she might still be harboring, the doubts and fears that might resurface when she least expected. He knew this process was ongoing, that healing wasn't linear, and he steeled himself for the long road ahead. One crisp October morning, Peter dropped Keisha off at school, watching as she walked toward the entrance. She was still a little slower than usual, still clutching her backpack like a protective shield, but she didn't turn back to glance at him like she had during the darker days. As he drove away, Peter allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. He wanted to believe that Keisha's bullies had learned their lesson, that the interventions the school had promised were working. The principal had followed through on her word. She had spoken with the children involved, organized meetings with their parents, and set up counseling sessions for Keisha. It was progress, but Peter wasn't ready to fully exhale yet. He knew the impact of bullying didn't fade so quickly, and neither did the cruel dynamics among children. It would take time, and more than just the principal's promises, to rebuild the confidence Keisha had lost. But for now, Peter allowed himself a sliver of hope. Later that afternoon, Peter sat at his desk at work, typing out emails, when his phone rang. He saw the name flash across the screen. Principal Carter. His heart leaked into his throat. His hand froze for a split second before he answered. "Hello? Mr. Morgan, it's Principal Carter," her calm, steady voice came through the line. "I wanted to give you a quick update." Peter braced himself for bad news, his mind already racing through worst-case scenarios. "Is Keisha okay?" "Yes, she's fine," Principal Carter quickly reassured him. "In fact, I think you'll want to hear this." Peter's shoulders sagged with relief. "Go on." "We've been closely monitoring Keisha and her interactions with the other students as we discussed," she began. "And today, something happened. One of the girls who had been giving Keisha a hard time approached her in the hallway. At first, I thought we might have another incident on our hands, but it turned out to be something else entirely." Peter's grip tightened on the phone, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "The girl apologized to Keisha," Principal Carter said, her voice softening. "She told her she was sorry for what she had done. Apparently, after the counseling sessions and some discussions with her parents, she realized how wrong she had been. Keisha accepted her apology." Peter blinked, stunned into silence. An apology? After all this time? He had hoped for change, but he hadn't expected this kind of turnaround. "That's incredible," Peter finally managed to say. "How did Kesha take it?" "Well, at first she seemed unsure, but I could tell she was relieved." Principal Carter continued. "It's not easy to forgive, especially after everything Kesha's been through. But I think she's finding her way through this. She's been doing really well in our counseling sessions too, processing everything." Peter felt his chest swell with a mix of pride and gratitude. His little girl, already so brave and resilient, was not only standing up for herself, but learning how to navigate the complexities of forgiveness and healing. "Thank you for telling me," Peter said, his voice thick with emotion. "And thank you for everything you've done. I wasn't sure things would get better, but I think they're finally starting to." Principal Carter paused, then added, "Kesha has an incredible support system. She's a strong girl, Mr. Morgan. I think she's going to be just fine." Peter ended the call feeling lighter than he had in months. He couldn't wait to hear Kesha's side of the story. That evening, when Kesha got home, she was quiet, but it wasn't the same heavy silence she had carried for so long. This silence felt contemplative, as though she were deep in thought, working through something important. At dinner, Peter gently broached the subject. "Kesha, how was school today?" She looked up from her plate, her expression unreadable at first. "It was okay." Peter waited a beat, sensing she had more to say but didn't want to push her too hard. After a moment, Kesha sighed and put down her fork. "Daddy, one of the girls who used to make fun of me, she said she was sorry today." Peter nodded, trying to gauge her reaction. "How did that make you feel?" Kesha stared at her plate, her brow furrowing in thought. "I don't know. I guess it made me feel a little better. But it's still hard to forget how mean she was." Peter reached across the table and gently took her hand. "You don't have to forget, Kesha. What she did was wrong, and it hurt you. But it's okay to accept her apology if it helps you feel better. It doesn't mean you have to be friends or trust her right away." Kesha's eyes flicked up to meet his, searching for reassurance. "So it's okay if I still feel mad sometimes?" "Of course," Peter said firmly. "Your feelings are important, and you're allowed to feel whatever you need to. Forgiving someone doesn't mean you erase what happened. It just means you're choosing to let go of some of the hurt so you can heal." Kesha seemed to mull this over for a moment before nodding slowly. "I think I want to forgive her, but it's going to take time." Peter smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "That's okay. Take all the time you need." In the days that followed, Kesha continued to open up more. She told Peter how the other kids had started to change, how some of them had even stood up for her when someone made a rude comment about her hair. Slowly, the walls around Kesha's heart began to come down, brick by brick, as she started to rebuild her confidence. Peter, too, felt like he was finally coming up for air. The anxiety that had clung to him for so long began to loosen its grip, replaced by cautious optimism. He knew the journey wasn't over, that Kesha would still face challenges, but they had taken a huge step forward. One evening, as Peter helped Kesha with her homework, she paused mid-sentence, a thoughtful look on her face. "Daddy, do you think I'll always have to deal with people like that?" Peter sighed, choosing his words carefully. "There will always be people who don't understand or who are unkind, but what's important is how you handle it. You're learning to stand up for yourself, and that's what matters. And you know that no matter what, I'll always be here for you." Kesha smiled, her eyes bright. "I know, Daddy." A few weeks later, Kesha stood in front of her bedroom mirror, examining her reflection with a newfound sense of pride. Her curls, which had once been a source of pain, now seemed to shimmer with life. She had learned to love them again, to see them for what they were, beautiful, strong, unique. Peter stood in the doorway, watching her with a soft smile. "You look amazing, Kesha." She turned to him, her smile wide and genuine. "I feel amazing." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. The pain, the fear, the doubts, and finally, the healing. Peter stepped into the room and pulled her into a hug, feeling the warmth of her small body against his. "I'm so proud of you, Kesha." She hugged him back tightly, and for the first time in a long time, Peter felt like they had truly turned a corner. The journey wasn't over, but they were stronger now, together, ready to face whatever came next. And as they stood there, wrapped in the warmth of each other's love, Peter knew, without a doubt, that his little girl was going to be just fine.